Hey, Dr. Vinay Prasad here, and I'm back with a new video. I want to talk to you about whether or not we can relax restrictions 14 days after the second dose of vaccination. It's the topic of my new commentary on MedPage today. So I really find this such an interesting question. I find it interesting because it has to do with trade-offs and risk perception, and I also think that reasonable people can look at the exact same data and reach a set of divergent conclusions. I think there's quite a range of opinions one can reach. And on MedPage today, with my colleague David Aronoff, we wrote a pair of complementary op-eds where I took the position that 14 days after dose 2, if you're asymptomatic, you can relax some restriction. And David Aronoff took the position that now is not the moment to relax the restrictions. I think this commentary is important because it allows people to talk about the facts, what we know, what we don't know, how we think about risk. But I think it's also important because it shows us that we can still have these discussions in this modern world. There's nothing wrong with two academics, two professors of medicine with different backgrounds reaching slightly different conclusions. So I just want to walk you through my argument and maybe make a few other points about things I've read. My argument is simple. I'm talking about 14 days after dose 2 of the vaccine. I'm not talking about earlier than that. And so people say, well, the vaccine is only 95% relative risk reduction, 95% effective. I don't think that's the right statistic to use. I think the right statistic is, if you in fact complete vaccination with Pfizer or Moderna, you get both doses, and you go 14 days without symptoms, what is the probability that you, in this study, developed subsequent symptomatic SARS-CoV-2? And the answer was, it was very, very rare. It occurred in very few people, and the percentages that I calculate are 99.92 chance you won't get symptomatic COVID-19 in the Moderna study, and 99.95 you won't get it in the Pfizer study. So the probability of symptomatic SARS-CoV-2, very low. The probability of severe SARS-CoV-2, the kind of SARS-CoV-2 that sends you to the hospital, that probability was 0 cases in the Moderna study. There were 30 in the control arm. I believe there's 1 in the Pfizer study. That is extremely low likelihood of a severe SARS-CoV-2 state. And then the final thing is asymptomatic carriage. This is still early, nascent information, but we do know that in the Moderna study, when participants were swabbed at the timing of dose 2, that the rate of PCR positive asymptomatic COVID-19, or actually SARS-CoV-2, the virus, not the disease itself, that occurred in approximately 1 in 1,000 people in the vaccine arm, and there was a 60% reduction in that asymptomatic carriage. Getting a vaccine means you're primed to have a good immune response. If you are encountering the virus in the real world, your body is going to mobilize antibodies very, very quickly. And we know from the recombinant protein products that when you have these antibodies, you are more likely to clear the airway of the virus, and you clear it faster. So if you put it all together, it is almost surely the case that people who are vaccinated have a personal protection. In fact, that's what we know for sure. But it is almost surely the case they also are less likely to have transmissibility. They're less likely to spread the virus to other people by reduced asymptomatic carriage, by less severe disease when they get the disease, and by less disease altogether. So they are going to be less of a threat of spreading this virus. So the last piece of my argument had to do with masks or other restrictions. Now, we have had a very interesting dialogue around masks and what they add, and I got one right here, because I actually quite enjoy wearing a cloth mask. I like the anonymity it gives me on the street, but I really do quite like it. But I think we have to be honest about the evidence and the lack of evidence. And I would say that no matter how you feel about the evidence about universal cloth masking, I think there is a big question mark as to whether or not universal cloth masking has a benefit amongst people who have already been vaccinated with a vaccine with 95% relative risk reduction. I'm not aware of any compelling data that can provide information on that particular question. We're not talking about cloth masks for someone who hasn't been vaccinated. We're talking about a cloth mask for someone who has been vaccinated with a highly potent, incredible vaccine. So what studies are you hanging your hat on that this has an additional benefit, that this has an added delta? And I think there really is no real information to hang your hat on there. And I might admit that my sort of belief in biomedicine is that interventions with even modest effect sizes, which I believe this likely does have, those interventions are subject to diminishing returns. That as the absolute case rate or incident rate of a disease gets lower and lower and lower and lower, the event rate goes down, the delta you're getting from an added precaution, it's also got to go down commensurately. And the challenge is, of course, when you factor in real-world compliance and those sorts of challenges, at below some event rate, there is no added advantage, very likely, generally speaking. In this particular case, I think it's an open question. Nobody knows for sure. So, what do I say we tell people? These are, I want to read you verbatim from the article. I say, knowing these facts allows us to put it all together. Is it reasonable to tell someone that if they are asymptomatic 14 days after the second vaccine, they're highly unlikely to get COVID-19 and less likely to spread the virus, both by having less severe disease, less asymptomatic carriage, clearing the virus faster, stronger antibody responses, and fewer symptomatic cases? Absolutely, is my view. And I go further to say that it is entirely reasonable to believe that if you get vaccinated and you go this period of time, you can have some concession. That concession might be different for different people. Some people, we want to hug our mothers. Some people, we want to visit a loved one in a nursing home and be able to go maybe 2 visitors together. Some people want to have a few people over to their house, all vaccinated, and have dinner together. I'm a believer that if everyone is vaccinated, you can go back to doing normal things. I think that's what people want to hear. I think that's also what the evidence shows. The last point. Sometimes people push back on my argument and they say, well, what are the sociological ramifications of this argument? What's going to happen in a grocery store if somebody's there and they're not wearing a mask? How do you know if they're anti-mask or if they've been vaccinated? It's kind of tricky. And I say right up front in my article, there are a bunch of caveats, but one caveat is, private businesses are going to do what private businesses want to do to be able to run. The next caveat is, I think that the more scientists play this game of, if I say X, what will people think and what will they do in response, so therefore should I change my statements? I think the more we play this game, we're going to get ourselves in a heap of trouble. Because on the other hand, you could make the argument that if we downplay the potential benefits of vaccine, if we downplay that vaccine is returned to normalcy, people might be less likely to get vaccinated. I mean, I don't know. We're not good at these second-order effects. This is really speculation. It's not really science. It's really just rhetoric and speculation. And frankly, that's not our business. We should stay out of it. And let policymakers, let politicians, let the public decide. So I'm speaking really as somebody who's putting my medical hat on and looking at this data and seeing what it means. I think the last thing I would say is that people say that my strategy is not the safest. I would push back on that and say, yours is not the safest either. I mean, wearing the cloth mask is not the safest thing you can do. The safest thing we can all do is become total hermits. We can go into our individual rooms, close the door, get all our food delivered, in fact, minimize the delivery, so get a big batch of food delivered by some delivery service, and literally never go anywhere and interact with anybody in any context. That's the safest thing to do. But if you look at what people are actually doing, you realize that people are never doing the absolute safest thing. People are always doing what they think is reasonably safe. And I would contend that in this situation, 14 days after a vaccine, you feel fine, asymptomatic, it's reasonably safe to do some of the things that I described in the article. The last thing I would say, I'm a little bit troubled by some of the rhetoric online. And by that I mean there is a faction of people who have some affiliation with a university or academic medical center or are in the business of ideas, and they say that it's not right to have this kind of debate in the open. The public is not ready to hear it. It's potentially harmful. I've even seen things like it's misinformation. Misinformation isn't just if you disagree with it. Of course, misinformation is something beyond that. So I don't think they really understand what misinformation means, and I don't think they understand that academics is fundamentally a profession where reasonable, smart people should be empowered to disagree with each other and to articulate their different views. And we don't do anyone any favors by suppressing or hiding debates. We certainly don't do the public any favors by doing that. The public is too smart to have these ideas shielded from them. They can handle it. And I vehemently oppose this streak of, I think, frankly, anti-intellectualism and illiberalism in the academy that would censor or curtail a real and legitimate discussion. So those are just my thoughts. 14 days after dose 2, I think we're moving towards normalcy. Vaccination, in the absence of vaccine escape, is the path to normalcy. And I think it's a good thing. And I think the reality is people can say whatever they want to say on Twitter, but I have a feeling what they're going to do in the real world, and I know they're probably going to be voting with their feet on my side of the issue. So thanks for that.